I'd like to introduce the panelists sort of one at a time, with each of them giving remarks, because I think we actually have a perfect segue that was mentioned in Yoshua's talk, which is fundamentally a lot of ethics questions come down to conflicts of values. And so as it turns out, one of the panel members, Roll Dub, submitted a paper that he published on the archive fairly recently with two of his co-authors, Thomas Gilbert and Jonathan Mentz, which is on hard choices in artificial intelligence. And I think it's very relevant to this point. Roll's a postdoctoral scholar with the AI Now Institute in New York University, and during his PhD at Berkeley, he studied how to integrate machine learning and safety critical contexts, developing a new planning and operating paradigm for electrical utilities to use AI for the integration of renewable energy resources. Roll now studies how to integrate AI systems in ways that are just, safe, and sustainable. He aims to contribute to interdisciplinary approaches that reimagine AI development as fundamentally socio-technical and oriented towards empowering affected stakeholders. Next year, he will start as an assistant professor in technology at policy and management with the University of Technology in Delft in the Netherlands. Roll, your paper on hard choices in AI answered a ton of questions for me that were related to this panel on how to think about like the existential risk community and the fairness, accountability, and transparency communities. So I'd be curious if you could give a brief overview of that paper, as well as how you think about a core concept that you bring up in that paper, which is intuitive comparability, which I think hits at what Yoshua was talking about.
Thank you, Jack. I'm going to do my best. It's very much a working paper, so I also invite anyone here to give me feedback, concerns, questions. And it's also very much a dense paper that we're still trying to kind of flesh out in more detail. So that's why I'm here personally for my work. And in the paper, what we're, or maybe, I guess, Emmanuel, you had the perfect segue for me actually into this panel, where what I was thinking was that at the AI Now Institute, a lot of the work that I do, or that we do, is researching the social implications and kind of putting up those red flags that Yoshua, that you were talking about. And as a technical scholar on the team, a lot of my work has been to look at the responses from the technical communities in FedStar, the existential risk AI safety communities, where we see a lot of like really good intentions and the same kinds of urgency to address these social implications. But oftentimes, what we say in our recent report actually came out yesterday is that one of the core recommendations is that these technical approaches should really go beyond and address broader, beyond the technology and address the broader politics and social implications. And so for me, what I was trying to do with this paper is to see, how can we reach those people and not just convince them that they should do it, but convert them. And we ended up really building on this theory of intuitive comparability by Ruth Chang, who's a researcher at a philosopher at the University of Oxford, that basically typifies three kinds of ways of dealing with value issues or value conflicts. The first one is to be an epistemicist, which means basically what I see a lot in the existential risk AI safety community is how can we, it's the idea that you can always kind of find a way to resolve values. There's always a rule base or some kind of technical solution to incorporate how to align values. So the idea, the core idea there is value alignment, which is the idea that we can really translate these values into the machine in a way that corresponds with whatever all the stakeholders care about. And that is, in a sense, flawed for all the reasons that Yoshua was talking about, all the political, all the kind of vagueness around a lot of what safety means for different people in different contexts. It's always different. The other one is semantic indeterminism, which is what I see a lot with tech companies, is this idea that, well, values are fundamentally like incomparable, so let's just go ahead and fix it as we go. And this is what you, for instance, saw with Google when they had they got a lot of critique when a lot of Holocaust denial information kind of hit the top of the bar, top of the search. And a lot of people were afraid, like children researching Holocaust might start, start reading this Holocaust denial information. And Deirdre Mulligan at Berkeley wrote a wonderful paper trying to explain why explain the response of Google, which was, this is just how the algorithm works. People, there's an engine behind it that we are not responsible for, like, really intervening with how the search the search hits end up being listed. This is really just the result of how different people interact with our technology. And so Deirdre carefully kind of deconstructs that and shows like how, like, it tries to reimagine what it would look like to really reimagine how search works in a way that would deal with these issues. So this is a form of semantic indeterminism. And in the end, what Ruth Chang says that in the end, there are lots of value conflicts, but when we hit a hard choice, it's really our normative power. It's really our ability to kind of sense into our bodies, which is why I was thinking Emmanuel, and sense and deliberate and come together with different stakeholders if it's a choice that's on behalf of different of the public to make those choices. So what we then do is to basically use that to propose to bring that really to the developmental process for AI systems and how you design systems, how you even define the problem, how you design systems, how you train them, and then how you integrate them into a context. And then that naturally kind of leads to proposing a more democratic solution, which I'll stop here, but that's...
Yeah, we'll definitely come back to the democratic side, and I think your paper is a perfect segue to the next panel member I'd like to introduce. In particular, in your paper, you cite a notion of a moral crumple zone, which is something that Madeline Ellis introduced. So Madeline is a cultural anthropologist whose work examines the social impacts of AI and automation on society. As research lead and co-founder of the AI on the Ground initiative at Data and Society, she works to inform the ethical design, use, and governance of AI systems through the application of social science research and human-centered ethnographic perspectives. Her recent research is focused on how AI tech affects understanding of equity, values, and ethical norms, and how professional work lives work lives change in response. She has conducted fieldwork across varied industries and communities, ranging from the Air Force, civilian drone regulation, and commercial aviation to precision agriculture. She holds a PhD in anthropology from Columbia University and an SM in comparative media studies from MIT. So, Madeline, as I said, Roll's paper cites your notion of a moral crumple zone, which he used in the context of answering the question of whether it is up to a city's government to pass reforms to make the city safe for facial recognition, or whether the responsibility should be on the actual software companies producing the technology to make it sufficiently accurate such that there should be enough confidence to deploy it. I'd be curious if you could start off by talking about why you introduced this term, how you view it as an important notion for us to consider in AI.
In a few sentences, the idea of the moral crumple zone is a way to think about how is responsibility distributed when we have socio-technical systems that are making things happen in the world. So we sort of what happens when there's a really complex system with many layers that have people doing things distributed in time and space. The moral crumple zone is a way to talk about what happens when sort of old notions of the way we think about responsibility are not keeping up. This is based on like historical research looking at what happens when there are aviation accidents involving autopilots, and actually how hardware and really complex problems often get reduced to one single sort of pilot who is there. The Boeing case is a different case, so let's just set aside the most recent Boeing case. But it's a really true historical pattern, and the idea is that in a car, the crumple zone is meant to protect the human driver, right? If you get in an accident, your car, it has this sort of safety feature that protects the human. But what we talk about in the research paper is how in autonomous and AI systems, really complex automated systems, what gets protected is actually the integrity of the technological system itself. The fact that the technology does nothing wrong and it's always human error. And the human ends up being what we call this moral crumple zone, sort of absorbing the liability, both sort of in social perception as well as sometimes legally. And I think in the context of this panel, what I want to sort of bring to the table as an anthropologist is the role that social perceptions of these technologies play in sort of how they are governed and what they are expected to govern. And so as an anthropologist, we were also asked to sort of think about these three key words: ethics and fairness and safety. And as an anthropologist, all I can think is, but everyone has different definitions. And in fact, when we reduce everything to one sort of box, we lose all of the important gradations that actually need to occur, because what I think is safe is different than what I know when people often talk about, or what I think is safety. It's going to be different than what people who are, in the existential risk world are talking about when they talk about safety. It's going to be different than, a community village somewhere that actually doesn't have internet service all the time, right? And so to try and loop it back through the moral crumple zone, I think what is key is sort of understanding not only what we think words are doing or what technologies are doing, but what they actually are doing in the world and whether that matches up with our expectations. That was me trying to tie a little loop, but for introductory remarks, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, and we'll certainly come back in particular in some of your recent work on actually launching a healthcare tool and what this sort of notion of how you incorporate that in a socio-technical system. So the next speaker I'd like to introduce also has some interesting thoughts on how we should, really think about responsibility in systems. So Joshua A. Kroll is a computer scientist studying the relationship between governance, public policy, and computer systems. Currently, Joshua is an assistant professor of computer science at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, and he was previously a postdoctoral scholar at the School of Information at the University of California at Berkeley. His research focuses on how technology fits within a human-driven normative context and how it satisfies goals driven by ideals such as fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. So Joshua, his work spans algorithms, cryptography, software security, formal methods, bitcoins, and the technical aspects of cybersecurity. So there's a paper that he wrote that I think is particularly interesting, which was on the fallacy of inscrutability. And the first sentences in the abstract, I think, get right at the point which I would like you to talk about, which is that you say, quote, contrary to the criticism that mysterious, unaccountable black box software systems threaten to make the logic of critical decisions inscrutable, we argue that algorithms are fundamentally understandable pieces of technology. And you go on by claiming that a system's actions cannot be understood. Critics ascribe values to mechanical technologies and not to the humans who designed, built, and fielded them. Such a view defers too strongly to the power dynamics at play, placing actions with human agency beyond governance, control, and accountability. And so I think this really gets at the notion of how we think and how we talk about systems having an important notion or an important consequences in where the accountability is asked for. So I'd be curious if you could expand on this thesis, which is, I think, fairly a strong statement.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. I'm going to come back to that, but first I have an obligation, which I think is probably incumbent on many people in the room, and implicitly maybe for everyone else on the panel, but explicit for me, which is that I don't speak for my employer. So I'm speaking in my personal capacity. Everything I say should not be intended as the opinion of the Department of Defense or the US government to the extent that that's not a category mistake. In any case, I guess what I'm getting at there is to say that this discussion about the inscrutability or black boxness of models and computer systems is less about whether or not we can explain them at a technical level, but more about whether there is a power asymmetry between the people who create them and the people who interact with them or are affected by their existence. And so I like to situate these systems in terms of their life cycle, where they sit in the world, and I like to think of interventions in terms of governance. So when we focus on things like ethics or fairness or safety, we've sort of defined a lens for the problem, and we've defined the terms of the debate and the units of analysis that we're going to consider. When we say that an algorithm should be explainable or transparent, we're saying that the problem somehow has to be situated inside the little silver box that we all walk around with in our pockets or on our laps or in our data center racks. Of course, these terms are themselves up for debate. I think that's come out pretty strongly already in the panel. Well, it may be problematic to say that there's always a process for resolving values into alignment and situating them in the machine. I think we can situate them within the life cycle of a system, and we do that in practice in the real world through politics, through governance mechanisms, and that's important. And we have to find a way to situate not the values in the machine, but the machine within the values system that drives that political process, understanding that the questions that we're asking are questions about power and politics, and not questions about technology. The second thing that I wanted to point out in that vein is that I've been thinking a lot recently about automation and the ways in which automation means more than just AI, and I recognize fully in saying that sentence that the phrase more than just AI is grounds for expulsion from this conference. But forging ahead, despite that, I will say that when you think about automation, we often think about perturbations to systems, right? We think about the way the world is, and we think which technology is going to change something, automate some process, replace the decision of military commanders with autonomous weapons, for example. Not that I want to get too deep into that example, but we often think about perturbations, and sometimes, if we're being really sophisticated, we think about comparative statics. So we say, what is the equilibrium state of the world now, and what is the equilibrium state of the world in the future? And I think neither of these is really sufficient, right? The path that we take to get from one equilibrium to the other is important, and when we think just about perturbing the system, we sort of miss what the actual changes in equilibrium might be between the state that we're in now and the state that we're in the future. If you think about something that has been automated, like the containerization of shipping, it is very much the case that it was clear at the beginning of that lots of longshoremen and other dock workers would be put out of work. It was less clear how to manage that, but even less clear that this would lead to the hollowing out of cities where people worked and where the warehouses were, where people could move goods in and out of the ships, that these warehouses could be moved sometimes thousands of miles inland, that this would change the entire system of logistics and the entire system of global commerce. And so what I want to get at by that example is the idea that systems replace systems at their entire level. And so what we're doing with AI and with automation is we're replacing the systems in the world now with new systems, and the power relationships in those new systems are different to the power relationships now. And we have to figure out how to view that question, talk about that question, engage that question in a political process. The last point I wanted to make was this point about inscrutability that Jack started me off with, and that inscrutability and the power dynamics within a system are, in a sense, a design decision that we make. If we decide that a system is not going to keep certain records or allow us to do certain kinds of review and oversight, that's a decision that we made in designing the system. And I'll give an example leaning on Yoshua's example of advertising. So there is now a lot of discussion about whether we can explain why someone saw a particular political ad or a particular piece of content on a social network. And it is the case that the public position of many of the companies involved in this discussion is we can't tell you that, it's too complicated, there are too many factors, any explanation we could give wouldn't make sense. If you ask these same companies if the next iteration of their advertising software is going to decrease their revenue, they will say, absolutely not. We have metrics for that, and if it happens, we will shut it down. We will roll back immediately to the previous version. We have a team standing by to do that monitoring. That is something that we are very clear is not going to happen. So these claims of inscrutability are really a design decision. And the question we have to ask instead is how to hold the people responsible in the process accountable via governance mechanisms. That makes, to me, values are assessments of the entire system. And I really liked what Yoshua said, that ethics comes up at the seams, at points where the values conflict with each other. And so the question to me is, how do you take principles like the principles in the Montreal Declaration and operationalize them? Because that's going to lead us to building trust in and improving the acceptability of these technologies, which is something that's come up. And Jack is sort of nodding his head, which means I should stop talking.
Oh. Sorry. No, I think it's wonderful, and we'll certainly circle back. I'm just starting to feel guilty that I didn't immediately introduce everyone trying to do this sequence of segues. But with that said, Jacob Metcalfe, who is our next panel member, I think has a lot to say that I found very interesting on this topic of how it is that we should look at the values in systems. And I'll get back to that in a second, but Jacob Metcalfe is a technology ethics researcher and consultant specializing in responsible AI and ML. He's a researcher at Data and Society on the AI on the Ground initiative, where he works on the Pervade project, an NSF-sponsored large multi-sided study of research ethics in academic and industry data science. He also is the founder of Ethical Resolve, a consultancy that helps tech companies, civil society groups, and governments build ethics capacity. Jacob, about a year ago, you gave a talk at the 2018 Unintended Consequences of Technology conference, where you argued that we should stop calling technologies ethical or unethical. You said, quote, ethics accrue to human systems, not technologies. You went on, you say, quote, this algorithm is fair or this AI is transparent are not coherent claims. I think this echoes a lot of what Joshua was saying about the inscrutability of AI not really being how we should think about these systems. Could you expound a bit on these statements?
Sure. My background's in philosophy, but I spent enough time around anthropologists to know that a lot of... Is this on? Yeah. Okay. To know... So the primary skill set of a philosopher is to distill a conceptual structure down to its essence, right? But I spent enough time around anthropologists to know that's like a pointless thing to do. Because everybody has... there's too much variability in what it is that humans experience, and really what we want to pay attention to is how things are used and how people behave. And so, when I offer definitions here, I'm trying to tone down the stakes of the definitional work, but rather to say these are sort of temporary and local answers that I think are useful useful to people who want to make sense of the consequences of technology. Right? So when I say this algorithm is fair, is an incoherent claim, what I mean is fairness is a feature of human organizations, right? So what is coherent to claim is this organization that builds and deploys algorithmic tools endeavored to be fair, right? And what that means practically is, a lot of technologists have been pushing fairness metrics, right? So IBM has a product called Fairness 360. Very interesting product. I don't want to make it sound like I think it's a inappropriate thing to do, but I think there's a category error there. That tool is not measuring fairness. It is comparing the outputs of a system to formalized definitions of fairness, right? And there are a potentially infinite number of formalizable definitions of fairness. Fairness is the hardest, oldest problem in humanity, for humanity. We don't know what's fair, and we never will. We'll only have temporary local definitions that are relevant to them, to the moment, right? And it's a ton of hard work to get to those definitions. Some of them can be made sense of in a numerical system. The real work, and the thing that we're actually genuinely bad at, is deciding as organizations or as a society which kind of fairness is preferable, right? That's the actual hard work for a technology company. It's not building a tool that will compare the outputs of an algorithmic system to a formalized definition of fairness. It's deciding which fairness is the fairness that matters to us, which fairness is the fairness that that will point us towards the world that we want to build and live in. What are the statistical trade-offs that we're willing to accept as an organization as we're building these systems, right? So, really what my work focuses on is thinking of these concepts of ethics, fairness, responsibility as a kind of organizational capacity, right? This is something we do as a group together in pursuit of a common goal. These are not end states, right? There's saying this algorithm is ethical is not a coherent claim because ethics is not an end state, it's a process. On a similar note, I think it's worth distinguishing between ethics and values in a certain way where you'll hear a lot of folks in the sort of this world, right, of responsible or humanitarian or ethical AI complain about the term ethics. It seems to be an empty vessel. It doesn't have the same sort of weight as human rights does. It seems to be like ethics is we're capable of doing this like ethics washing, right, where you have an empty process and you just declare the output to be ethical without any real engagement with weighty norms like human rights. So I'm an oddball in this space and thinking like that is actually the greatest strength of this thing we called ethics. What we need to be better at is deciding what values fill that empty vessel, right? So ethics as an institutional capacity is the ability to reason through problems together rigorously and effectively, right? Values are essentially statements about what we want the world to be like, and there are many different values, and there are many value conflicts. The question is, what do we as an organization or as an institution or as a society or whatever it is we are in this room, what are our shared values is actually the harder debate. And we're pretty bad at it. So I think that if we can figure out sort of how to hold still this question of ethics a little bit and keep it as what are the sort of due diligence practices we can do as an organization? And then you ask the harder question of, and what are the values we're going to use to fill up that empty vessel, that sort of raw process?
So on the subject of harder questions, our last panelist, again, has already been introduced and is the most senior, so they'll get, I think, the most pointed questions of all the panelists so far. Yoshua, you're one of the very few AI pioneers to take very strong public stances on ethical red lines in your field. While a large number of researchers signed petitions opposing lethal autonomous systems, you've famously refused to accept any of the huge salaries available to you at the major tech companies and have spoken out in an interview with MIT Tech Review in 2018 about the, quote, concentration of power, money, and researchers. The best students want to go to the best companies. They have much more money. They have much more data. This isn't healthy. Even in a democracy, it's dangerous to have too much power concentrated in a few hands. You touched a lot on these notions in your talk earlier, but I would say more provocatively, you argued that AI experts should be weary of working with militaries, even on defensive weapons, quote, because they tend to put duty before morality. Would you extend such an analysis to building facial recognition or predictive policing technology for law enforcement?
So this is working? Yeah. There are difficult questions. I think the case of face recognition is an example where there are clearly nefarious uses. You could also imagine positive uses. You might, use this for your home security or whatever. But then the ethical question is, well, we need to put all of these things in the balance, and I haven't really thought enough about this particular one, but it seems obvious to me that it's worth scholars and the public really having that discussion and regulators getting into this. I want to, maybe if you allow me, bounce on a few things that were said. So I guess starting the debate. One thing you mentioned about the importance of defining what is fair. I agree, it's a difficult question, and in fact, there is no formal answer to that, as you said. But you also put it like if once we have a definition, and we don't, and we won't have, then it's easy to turn that into algorithms that try to optimize for it. It's not always easy. So, computer scientists who've been working on this have put out a lot of work. I don't think we should decrease the value of that work. But you're right that it doesn't, it doesn't solve the bigger question of what it is that we should consider fair. And that gives me a segue to maybe touching on the point that you raised about value alignment, right? So humans have not been able to formalize what is morally good over the last millennia. And I think there are good reasons for this. It's because there is no simple set of rules that can do it. And that's interesting in touching on the subject of value alignment, because so value alignment is about, say, building into machines objectives, goals, rules, constraints, behaviors that will be compatible with human morals and values. And it's a hard question, but it's not one that we can. One reason why it's hard is that, well, we can't formalize things, as I said earlier, about what is right and wrong. So what makes more sense, at least the first order answer to this is, and it's a very important one, we're not going to be able to top-down tell machines what is right and wrong, because we ourselves can't do it. We've tried to do it in a way with the legal systems, right, and regulations and so on, but it doesn't work. So, I mean, it's not completely useless, of course. Legal system is very, very useful, but as organizations become powerful, like think multinationals, they can optimize for maximizing profit under the legal constraints, and they end up finding solutions that are just on the border of being legal while almost always being immoral, right? And what does that mean? It means that the laws somehow didn't properly circumscribe what was acceptable for humans. And this is so this is interesting, and it connects to my statement about a few set of rules and even a large set of rules like we have in our legal systems are not enough to describe what is good for, acceptable for humans. Now, there's a different tack on this, which people like Stuart Russell have been looking at, who investigate value alignment from a mathematical and computer science perspective. And I think it's very interesting, and I want to mention it. So the idea here is, well, we won't be able to define it formally. We won't even be able to learn to train a machine, say by imitating humans, to figure out what is right and wrong. But it goes beyond the fact that different people have different values. It's just that, so the important part of this that Stuart focuses on is that there's always going to be some part of it which is unknown, right? So as a human or as a machine, I don't fully know what your values are, but I can behave according to that self-knowledge of my limited knowledge, right? I know that I don't know some things. And computers could be designed in that way so that they would not act in a way that might hurt someone, say, because maybe this is gonna go against their values or something like this. So this is an interesting change in perspective, right? So it's a little bit like a meta aspect to it, and I think this is going to be an important part of the solution. And thinking about these questions also makes me think that what we are learning in machine learning and AI about those difficulties of aligning computers with sort of what is socially good could also teach us things about society, right? Like I was mentioning large corporations, which are like super intelligent beings, right? And how we should maybe change the way society sets the rules of the game so that the economic actors behave in a way that's more aligned with the generally admitted social good values. And I think it is possible if we move away from a legal system that focuses on easy to check and well-defined rules to a legal system that puts a greater burden on human judgment. In other words, asks, say, corporations to behave in a way that another human or a group of humans would judge to be beneficial or socially positive, right? And of course, it's harder to define that, but we do it already. So as an example, a working example of this, as academics, we write grant proposals, and usually there are no rules to say that this is a good grant or a better grant or whatever. And the way we do it is we ask humans, using their intuition, which is a very, very complex computing process, to to come up with an answer to, well, how valuable is this proposal or this piece of work? And I think we could do the same thing for corporations. We're not doing it, so we could have, instead of you're illegal or you're legal, we could have human auditors and ethicists participate in evaluating the value of the behavior of corporations to society, which can be translated then into fiscal incentives or punishments or whatever.
So on the subject of kind of human mechanisms for encouraging...
I don't think we are hearing you.
Oh, it's on. There we go. So on the subject of kind of actual practical mechanisms for encouraging values to end up in deployed technologies, Madeline, in your paper, the human body is a black box, you argued, quote, rather than focusing solely on model interpretability to ensure fair and accountable machine learning, we point towards 4 key values and practices that should be considered when developing machine learning to support clinical decision making. 1, rigorously define the problem in context. 2, build relationships with stakeholders. 3, respect professional discretion. And 4, create ongoing feedback loops with stakeholders. It seems that there's largely an agreement on some of these points, and I'd be curious, does everyone agree with that being a useful mechanism to interpret ethics, or how to promote ethics? And to what degree do you think that encouraging the values of the stakeholders, like how would you incorporate the values of the scientists developing the technology as well into that process in a fair way.
So I just want to sort of amplify something that Jake said and does in his practice, which is about this idea of like organizational capacities and also even individual capacities to think ethically. Jake, something that you often talk about is that ethics is a way, or the study of ethics is a way to sort of pick out what is salient in a situation, and right, whether I should pay attention to this piece or that piece. And I think something that was really unique in how this project that was the subject of the paper that you mentioned, which is a collaboration with the Duke University Institute for Health Innovation. Is Joe in here? Yeah. Joe is one of the technical leads on the model development, but this was actually really a organizational and clinician led solution. And so it actually started with a real problem that was identified by key stakeholders in an organization, and then a set of resources. The Duke team ended up sort of collecting a set of human and organizational resources to address that problem. And developing a model was one piece of that. But there was an understanding that this was a socio-technical system that was going to necessarily touch on not only issues of statistical fairness, but also issues of workplace fairness in a way, and actually how were the workers, the frontline clinicians, going to be affected when this technology came into their workplace. Because I feel like often when we talk about solutions and when we talk about the dimensions of fairness and safety, we are often thinking about AI that is sort of still trapped in this box in our pockets, right? And actually, the thorniest questions come up when these technologies are integrated into organizations. And I actually specifically try and not use the word deploy, but rather use the word integrate, because deploy is really like a contextless dropping in, right? It's a military term, you just like deploy and go. It's like, oh, we're done, we dropped it. Right? And actually, what we need to do to confront what actually is at stake in fairness, safety, and thinking through ethics is thinking about what happens when we integrate these technologies into existing situations. And I think that we're all probably on board with that, but I just want to kind of add that in there.
So on that subject of integration, and given that you raised the military question, one of the things that might happen is that the stakeholder, say it's a military that comes in and wants a cloud computing contract. And if we interpret the values of the stakeholders perhaps conflicting with the values of the developers that are building this project, that integration process will have tensions and values that need to be navigated. And Roll's paper talks a lot about the notion of dissent being in every stage of the pipeline of AI development, being critical to raise the level of discussion, and Yoshua also talked about this with the Montreal Declaration, with that actual discussion raising the nuance of the conversation. So I would open up for question as to how do you navigate the degree to which the developers can override, or how do you balance the values between the developers and the stakeholders in a fair way? Because on the extreme end, we have what I would argue the weapons contractors tend to argue, which is we have no say, we have no responsibility in the ethics of what we build, we simply comply with policy. So that's one extreme end. And so I'd be curious, how do you balance that tension between potential conflict of developers and stakeholders?
Yeah, so what I think we're living in is a time where more and more people are starting to see that there's a privatization of the public space going on, in especially in our digital infrastructure, And so when I was listening to you, Yoshua, talking about like what would it look like for technology companies and technical research to be like scrutinized by human judgment, that did resonate with this idea of dissent. So in our paper, what we did was study the epistemic affordances of democracies. So not just thinking of a democracy of the majority rules, but really how do democracies contribute to safe societies or to safe systems or infrastructures? And dissent is very important there. And so I think since we're like kind of waking up collectively, we really need those tech workers and other like workers across the board to help us from within these companies to establish these means of these democratic channels and these channels for dissent. So our paper is really trying to raise the bar, and I'm fully aware that it's, you know, in some ways it's idealistic, but it's also necessary. And so, yeah, like I think this should be like a long-term. Like that's why we're talking about socio-technical commitments, like going beyond principles and even beyond like, oh, what do the practical, like ethical or fairness processes look like? No, what are we really committed to? So talking about socio-technical commitment and how does that look like for me as a researcher, or for you as a tech worker, et cetera.
We sort of have a jump on this because we were discussing this last night over dinner. But it feels like something that is sort of a precursor to this sort of alignment, or this ideal of alignment between, or this possibility of alignment between stakeholders and developers, which you sort of put on potentially opposing sides, is a requirement that I actually don't think is quite there yet around transparency of what the technologies can actually do. And I actually think that is a really often taken for granted, really important step, right? Because if I think a lot of miscommunications on both sides occur when maybe a police department is receiving something that they should have been told really, only works in like these situations, in these contexts, at this degree of accuracy. Like there just needs to be more communication so that stakeholders can understand what's at stake, and also perhaps so that developers can see what stakeholders are also taking for granted. So I think that there's like a communication and transparency loop about actual capacities, which is really missing, and which is a precursor to your comment.
I think the problem here is that the police departments are being sold something, and when you sell something, you are not always very truthful about the whole picture. And so we can't go by this process. We need to find a different way that the information flows, that forces transparency about all of the things you were talking about.
I think Josh wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, so I think here and always really through the whole panel, we're talking about what is the right way to operationalize something that we can't necessarily see. There's a great new paper just actually put up yesterday, I think, by Abby Jacobs and Hannah Wallach from University of Michigan and Microsoft Research, respectively, about measurement and how it relates to human values, and how we would think about what social scientists refer to as construct validity, that you actually are capturing the construct that you think you're capturing in the tools that you have in the way you intend to capture it. And we generally, as scientists, think of that under the banner of measurement. Are we getting the right thing? And that relates a little bit to what Madeline said about capabilities and limitations, but I think it also relates to this predictive policing question, in the sense that in a predictive policing context, you're trying to predict crime, but you don't have any really good measurements of crime. You have some good proxies, maybe. I mean, you have some proxies. Maybe they're good, maybe they're not. But you don't know, and unless you engage with the question of how good are they and what are they good for, you're not going to answer that question. And similarly to the question of operationalization, we as computer scientists often think solely in terms of rules, right? If we can if it's a rule, we can code it up, we can make the machine do that thing. The law thinks about this question much more expansively. There are other kinds of ways of operationalizing constructs in the law that are not rule-based, based on what legal scholars would call standards or principles, depending on whether they are sort of general or whether they provide you with some kind of points of grasping for, and I see some lawyers in the room sort of staring at me and telling me that I shouldn't be teaching about the law. But anyway, there is a debate here which is well formed and which we should recognize takes the idea beyond just the question of what are the rules and into human judgment.
So as maybe one final question, on the point to talk about tensions of values, you need to know the scope of the projects. It's often the case that strategically managers might withhold information from workers for the reason that they know how they would respond if they actually had a complete picture of a project. So to what degree, how would we talk about the notion of a tech worker even being able to fight for that amount of transparency? Should this be something that you think of as contractual? Should you negotiate it for it when you're hired? Like, what's the appropriate way to even get that transparency, given there's many motivations to not provide it, to even start this conversation on balancing values?
So right now we are in a society where employees have first and foremost a duty to their employer. And I think we should change the laws so that they have first and foremost a duty to society, even if it might be that their employer is going to make less money or something like this. So that there's a conflict here, and it leads to the kind of things I was talking about before, where some large companies end up acting in a way that's bad for most people. Right now, the people inside those companies who act according to their conscience, are facing a very, very stiff challenge and battle. And I think we need to empower them with the right laws that, there's already been some movement on whistleblowers, for example, but I think that's just one little aspect of it. There should be a legal responsibility for employees to act according to the moral good of society first.
Yeah, so I guess the question I was trying to ask is, if you're not given enough information to evaluate that decision, you can't even engage in this act of
the transparency aspect is crucial for any of this to work. And in general, I think a lot of bad things are happening because it's happening behind closed doors and among small circles. So we need to not only empower employees, but also empower them with the right information and the public in general. So there should be a lot more transparency. So, in many countries, we have laws that say things like, almost every information that is being communicated inside the government eventually becomes public, right? Why don't we have the same thing inside companies?
The phrase that comes to my mind when you're sort of talking is also, to make a cake, you have to break a few eggs. And I'm also thinking about the word bravery. And I wonder if, we need sort of structural changes, but I wonder also if this community and a sort of this growing community needs to think about themselves as powerful and as able to demand and sometimes break eggs, right? And what we've really seen in the last year or two is sort of solidarity among tech workers of all kinds, of all levels, thinking about how do we both fight for structural changes and laws, but also how do we be brave in our individual lives to sort of figure out how can we demand, or how can we say there's going to be a consequence if like if someone's sort of demanding for transparency and then saying, no, there's going to be a consequence, I'm going to sort of take a stand. And I think that that's actually how we've seen a lot of things slowly move forward in the past year, is people being brave and standing up. So I think probably just encouraging ourselves as a community to keep being brave is important too.
So thank you for that. And I think on the note of a call to action, I think that's the perfect time to close the panel discussion and open it up for questions from the audience.
So we'll just do a couple questions now before much needed coffee, and then there'll be the rest of the day for questions as well.
Hi, I'm Tim O'Brien from Microsoft. I was a little surprised to hear so little reference to culture in engineering. There is a lot of well-intentioned efforts underway, as many of you pointed out, to develop tools, technologies, harms frameworks, architectural checklists, things that developers could use to make considerations at design time. But there's a mindset issue that many of them just don't feel a sense of personal responsibility for what they're building. As Yoshua pointed out this morning, there's a lot of effort underway to incorporate mandatory ethics curriculum into computer science. So this problem the mindset problem gets changed over time. But between now and then, there's developers around the world at banks, hospitals, governments, 92% male, 74% white or of European descent. So lived experience isn't going to change their mind anytime soon. What are your thoughts on the role of engineering leadership in these organizations to lead culture transformation, which is an order of magnitude more difficult than building out some of these tools?
I'll quickly hand it to others, but one thing that I think is really important, you can't just sort of talk about changing culture, you have to create different incentive structures. And right now, well, I'll let you talk. Because you were like, yep. So I'll just kind of put that on the table.
Yeah, I mean, I get to be a fly on a wall in a lot of conversations and workshops with the people who have jobs as ethics practitioners inside these companies, and almost universally there are questions of incentives. So it's how do you get ethics to be instantiated in an OKR or a KPI, right? That is a sticky note on every single whiteboard I've ever seen in those spaces. Yeah, I mean, there are probably there are some easier gets, right? Like getting some measure of ethics in a person's annual review, right? Like how do you just, if you're being peer reviewed, is there a space for your peers to say, this person thought carefully about ethics? And have that be part of your reward structure. So that, that's a relatively easy get that sort of leverages an already existing measure. And I think we can start, propagating out some shared wisdom about those low-hanging fruits, which will then ultimately make the harder to get fruit at the top of the tree more accessible to us.
I was going to say that in many discussions like these, there is a tendency to talk about the engineer as kind of the sole locus of ethical agency. And I think we've talked quite a bit about like the structural barriers. Jack, you started off with saying that a lot of engineers often don't know what they're working on. But really, in the end, what we need is accountability, and is not just incentives for engineers, but like incentives for product managers, incentives for sales executives. So I'll give you an example. Working in a Silicon Valley company over a summer during my PhD as an intern, and I was just basically tasked to sweep up the mess that existed, that came about when sales executives sold things that, it was a machine learning system that they sold at a certain level of accuracy that was basically impossible to ever reach. And so there was like a lack of interaction there between the people that technically knew what was feasible and the sales executives. And so those people actually really need those incentives much more, I think, than the engineers.
I just wanted to mention that the top-down effect of governments pushing these cultural changes can be fairly important. So in Canada, the government has been very, very active in this direction, changing a lot of doing things in the civil service. So the academic see this in a grant evaluation. We now have parts that have to do with equality, discrimination, and inclusiveness, and so on, being parts of the KPIs in the proposals, in evaluations, in recruitment. So this, and I can see how this is changing the mindsets of faculties across the country.
Good morning, everyone. Okay. It doesn't sound, I can't hear myself. In the spirit of bravery, as one of the only Black women in this space, the gentleman's question alluded to the underrepresentation or lack of representation of people of color, African American, Latinx, Native American, Indigenous people. And then the answer from the panel really leaned it toward ethics of systems and talking about this very abstract view of ethics and not talking directly about the fact that there is very little representation in this space, including this room, of people that there was conversation about policing and no real conversation about the marginalization of Black people with facial recognition. So my question is this: how can this community move from conflating diversity, equity, and inclusion with the conversation around ethics?
Thank you, first of all, for being brave and sort of naming lots of elephants in the room and putting them on the table. I don't have an answer. Jake, maybe someone else has an answer.
You perked up first.
I just wanted to say, I think one thing is to get more different kinds of people who have interactions with these systems in these rooms at the table, which can be really hard at a technical conference like this or like at FatStar. I would say the next panel, I think, is an effort of the organizers to try and get some of these voices and perspectives. I don't have an answer, but I thank you for asking the question and getting it here.
Yeah, I want thank you for your brave statement. And I do want to acknowledge. Switch mics. Yes, mic dead. All right. I do want to acknowledge like the leading thinkers in the space, people who a lot of us draw a lot of inspiration from, are women of color. So, Yoshua Bengio, Joy Bolomino. Women of color are in many ways the leading thinkers in technology ethics now, right? And they deserve a lot of credit for what they've done. I do want to push back against the conflation idea, though. I actually think this is a space where we can newly think through diversity and inclusion as something not as raw representational numbers, right? That actually, if you look at the organization, the efforts to organize tech employees to resist sexism or misogyny and racism in tech industry, they're often around claims about technology ethics also, right? So it's we shouldn't be building surveillance systems that target people of color. We shouldn't be building facial recognition systems that are meant to sort the Han Chinese from the Uyghurs, right? There's actually an interest, to me, there's an interesting new twinning or hybridization between questions of inclusion, diversity, and ethics. And so I'm not sure, I see your point, like we can be way too abstract in those questions, and probably we were in this conversation. But it's actually that twinning that I want to encourage, because I think it makes both conversations richer, and it's actually, it seems to me, anthropologically, what's happening on the ground.
So, again, we did not have a conversation about people of color at all. And that's my point.
Yep.
So, I understand you push back, but I'm here to push back again, because we didn't have that conversation. And by the way, my name is Brandeis Marshall.
I also want to thank you for being brave and sharing that with us. I think at the moment we see a lot of brave people of color and people with underrepresented minority backgrounds that have entered the spaces, these kinds of spaces, tech spaces, research spaces, and have, you know, oftentimes under the banner of like diversity and inclusion, but then have kind of really ran into these cultural barriers and structural issues. And so I think it's, again, we're living in a time where this, we need to do much better and like go back to the drawing table as organizations, as companies, research institutions. What I can offer, I think one thing is like people say often like we need to give space to people. I don't think it's just about giving space, it's about noticing the space. We really need to notice the space we're in and what is it that that creates you know, these forms of misogyny, racism, and even like people that we think we're empowering are either burning out or like really running into walls to make structural changes. And the other thing I wanted to say is, so please, you know, talk about that. What does it mean to not to just to give space, but to notice, to fill into that space? The other thing I want to share, as a pointer, is a report that my colleague Sarah Myers-West wrote at the AI Now Institute called Discriminating Systems, where we're really trying to bring together a lot of historical research, and because these issues have come up, you know, not just over the last couple of years, but decades ago, to help people understand not just how these cultural issues arise, but also how they translate into how we build technologies.
Just because this is a really important conversation, I want to just push it forward and push it out. And so I saw someone had their hand up over there. Is this a, how would you answer your question? How would other people who are in this room answer that question?
At some point we're talking about those easy fruits to pick or something, and there's this thing I've been thinking about, and it's I'm from Brazil, and the racial discussion back there is really different than it is here at in North America, mostly because there is no really for a long time there was no really widespread racial discussion. It's like Black people in Brazil, they suffer by being Black, and at the same time, they are denied, the right to know this is actually for this, because, that's how it went back there. We can get into the details if someone wants to talk more about it. But there have been some slowly changes but significant ones that has happened in recent years, and we are seeing things that there was not at all. There's nothing like, Black television or Black products, although we are like 56% of Brazilian population. But things are starting to slowly change, and it has a lot to do with, some affirmative actions that started to be incorporated in top universities and stuff. And the thing is, some of them have actually changed like the market landscapes, because you had people having different concerns, so people had access to other stuff. And I've been here a lot about this. Oh, we gotta incentivize tech workers. We gotta have this discussion when building models. But I think it's as important, maybe more important, just so we make more efforts, like to do more outreach, to put this information out there, to go to the peripheral parts of society who are the most affected by it, so they can also have this information, so they can also have a say in it, because we gotta be pretty innocent, pretty naive, or pretty privileged to think that, only here, we in this room, at the very center of the world of, all the AI discussions, we can see the struggles of the people who are really suffering at the far ends of the society. So I think there's not enough effort inside the community. I actually used to do physics research where the problem was even, further in that direction. But I don't think there is not enough outreach back there. We are not trying to include those poorest people. How we are living, we have the internet, and yet information is not as democratized as it could be, or as it should be. And I think we should focus more on bottom-up transformations, because in changing the general mentality, because this has the power, at least, for now. This was changed the rules of the game. I have an example I can, share with those of you who are interested. That, when people get a saying, and then when the discussion is more public, then that's what we're already seeing. Those companies are not worrying about having ethics departments or having fairness departments, because they are all of a sudden, turning into this goodwill thing. It's more because the discussion has been put out there, and now we actually got to the point where they can lose money for not doing it, for appearing like this. And I think the great advances comes when we have more people involved in the discussion, we have more people having a say in it, we're having more people input their ideas and their struggles, and we have to be really, really careful to just to resist the temptation of having all these abstraction discussions too far away from where the struggle really is, and not being worried of taking the information there where people need it the most.
I agree. Thank you so much for sharing. In the spirit, I want to ask how we are in time. I was going to say in the spirit of hearing more people, but I don't know if we're out of time.
Hear more people. If there is coffee out there, but please do stay for a few more questions, comments.
So thank you again. I mean, bridging, one thing that I'm thinking about that bridges this discussion, I think a lot of the discussion has been around organizations and organizational capacity. And one recent work that I think about a lot when it comes to the AI space and the tech space is the idea about racialized organizations. So Victor Ray, who's a sociologist, has a theory of racialized organizations. And by racialized organizations, when we say something like, there are black newspapers, there are Latinx newspapers, there's black media companies. But when we talk about, we assume organizations are sort of race neutral. But no, we need to call it out. These organizations are white. Tech companies are white. NERPs, hella white. Like, I live in Oakland, I have to say hella. So, I mean, so
this panel.
What now?
Hella white. This panel.
Yeah, this panel, hella white. So, I mean, the idea of drawing out the explicit nature of the discussions and organizations as white and what the properties that does is incredibly necessary. And I really appreciate comments by Ramon and calling out explicitly the necessity of changing the organizations. DEI is not just about having more people and having opportunities, it's about having people in those spaces and creating fundamentally organizational change. You're turning an organization from a white organization to one that is not solely white, okay? whiteness works as a property. It works as something that people trade on, white people trade on. And so negotiating what that means in an organizational setting is something that we really need to dig on. And so if you're talking about things like organizational capacity, about ethics, these things have to come, properties like fairness have to be agreed upon, but they're not going to be agreed upon in a way that is beneficial to people of color in white organizations. We must make that explicit.
Try to think about one of the so-called easy gets in terms of KPIs, including considerations of ethics in KPIs. How much should that include concerns of representation? I mean, these are not perfect measures. So while we're acknowledging that these are not perfect measures, how much should someone's presence in a classroom as a person of color be considered just directly as a measurement? This is really a question for everyone, but a lot of these concerns came up.
Does anyone from the audience want to address that, or then defer to the panel?
Sure. I mean, especially if we're, as Alex so hopefully pointed out, we're talking about tech companies as white organizations. We also have to recognize that metrics like KPIs are highly vulnerable to discrimination against non-white employees. And so they're not cure-alls in and of themselves. And so, yeah, I mean, I think much more multifactorial assessments of peers that can actually account for implicit and explicit biases within the organization, I think will get us, the easy get is still not in itself, it's far from perfect, right?